Good afternoon. Today our committee will consider a resolution of inquiry offered by Mr. Pascrell that is related to President Trump's confidential tax and financial information. I'm going to keep my remarks short today because, frankly, this resolution is a procedural tool being utilized, and I think abused, for obvious political purposes. It does absolutely nothing to promote a substantive policy discussion on the real-life challenges facing the people, families, and job creators we are sent here to serve. With this resolution, the minority is seeking to have the Treasury Department collect 10 years of President Trump's individual tax returns, along with a potentially extensive amount of other confidential financial information, and then turn that information over to Congress. To my knowledge, in our committee's entire history, no single individual has ever been targeted in such a manner. Let me say that again. While this committee has, at times, sought tax return information as part of our legislative responsibility to oversee the administration of our nation's tax code, this would be the first time the committee has exercised authority to wade into the federal tax returns of a single individual with no tie to any investigation within our jurisdiction. Furthermore, there is no mechanism through which the Treasury Secretary could legally comply with this request as written. As I'm sure the sponsor of this resolution is aware, Section 6103 only permits confidential tax information to be furnished to the committee, not to the House Representatives as the resolution directs. But beyond its obvious legal shortcomings, supporting this resolution would be a clear invasion of privacy. I would ask that all of our committee members to take a step back for a moment and consider the dangerous precedent of abuse that would be set by this resolution. If Congress chooses to use this power to single out President Trump for political purposes, invade his privacy, and seize his confidential tax information, what prevents them from doing the same to other Americans? Civil liberties and privacy are still rights worth protecting, and I intend to protect them. I will oppose this resolution. I urge all members of our committee to do the same. With that, I'll yield to Ranking Member Neal for his opening statements that he may have. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you can tell, my voice, because of a cold, is not there. But before I yield to Mr. Pascrell, every American president since Gerald Ford has yielded his tax forms to the public. And with that, I'd yield my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope at the end of this markup, we'll all end up on the same page about the significance of this issue and our responsibility on this committee. It is our responsibility under the Constitution, Mr. Chairman, very clear, to provide oversight of the executive branch and root out conflicts of interest. That is our responsibility. It is defined in the Constitution of the United States. Breaking with 40 years of precedent, Donald Trump has refused as a candidate and as president to release his tax returns, which begs the question, what is he hiding? We know that under Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code, this committee, the Committee on Ways and Means, has the authority to obtain for review, President Trump's tax returns. We have justifiable cause, Mr. Chairman, not only to review simply for tax compliance, but also for conflicts between his government position and his business interests. On February 1st, I wrote you a letter. I didn't go to the press. I didn't have a press conference. I did not have a press release. I heard no reply. I wrote a simple second letter on March the 2nd. This time, it was a bipartisan letter, Democrats and Republicans, with 165 members of the House of Representatives as signatories. And multiple Republican members of the House have publicly called for Mr. Trump to release his tax returns. including Mr. Corbello from Florida, a member of this committee. The New Yorker recently published a letter from George Yin, professor of law of the University of Virginia, former chief of staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is one of the committees under 6103 that can ask for this information. Mr. Yin wrote about the legal authority this committee possesses, quote, unquote. The 1924 law, the result of a conflict of interest concerns about the Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon at that time and executive branch officials involved in the Teapot Dome scandal, gives Congress the authority to examine Trump's returns revealed into the public without the president's consent. Members of Congress cannot blame the absence of information solely on the president's intransigence. Instead, they must explain why they favor the same secrecy that the president does, unquote. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit this letter for the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I want to present to you, before I continue, the latest issue, story about the Teapot Dome scandal. I hope you have a chance to read it. I present it to you in good faith.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is President Trump responsible for this as well? May I ask, Bill?
You'd be surprised, Mr. Chairman.
We have to have an investigation, no?
We don't know until we see.
Thank you. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
would you like to continue?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yin has expounded on this issue in an academic paper, quote, "The Preventing Congressional Violations of Taxpayer Privacy," it was in the Tax Lawyer, volume 69, number 1, in which he writes that following the Teapot Dome scandal, Congress had already sought to obtain from President Coolidge the confidential tax return information of some of the alleged principals.
Mr. Pascrell, I'm sorry all time has expired, but we will be moving in a moment to strike the last word. So the committee will now proceed to consideration of House Resolution 186. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Now, does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Thank you.
I'll do it.
Is that a parliamentary inquiry?
Mayor, I thought we were going to 10 minutes on the opening statement. That's what we were told.
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Pascrell.
Well, weren't told from the heavens. We were told from your staff.
Yeah, our regular order is 5 minutes in opening statements.
Okay,
So-
Mr. Chairman.
And we will have plenty of time for members to yield to you or any other member if they wish.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I'd like to move to strike the last word, if that's appropriate.
Yes, sir. You're
Give
recognized.
my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Congress had already sought to obtain from President Coolidge the confidential tax return information of some of the alleged principals. You'll read about those principals in that book I just gave you, involved in that scandal. And the president ultimately acceded to the request. But this experience undoubtedly demonstrated to Congress its need to have direct access to the information independent of the president's authority. I submit for the record Professor Yin's paper.
Without objection.
The conflicts are piling up. Smoke is billowing from the White House. There is a gray cloud, quote unquote, and my good friend Mr. Nunes said. And a senior member of this committee, I might add. And the cloud of smoke has become too large, grows every week, too ominous to ignore any longer. Just this week we learned that the president's top advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, sat down with Sergio Korkev, the chief of the Neshkovan Bank, Russia's largest state-owned bank during the presidential transition. The United States had placed this bank on its sanctions list after President Vladimir Putin of Russia annexed Crimea and began meddling in the Ukraine. Despite claims that nothing of consequence was discussed at the meeting, Mr. Kushner took this meeting at the behest of Russian Ambassador Kislyak, which was intended to, quote-unquote, deliver a message. Last week, the FBI Director, James Comey, confirmed in testimony to the Congress that his agency had begun a counterintelligence investigation into Russian interference and whether any associates of the president might have colluded with the Russian government during the 2016 campaign. I didn't say that. Director Comey said that. Congressman Adam Schiff, the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, has said that there is more than circumstantial evidence now that President Trump's campaign colluded with Russia's attempts to influence the election and hurt the Clinton campaign. This is on the top of what we already know about Russia's connections to Trump, associates like Michael Flynn, Carter Page, Roger Stone, and the new Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Paul Manafort, a former Trump campaign manager, appears to have laundered money from the party of an ex-leader of Ukraine with ties to Russia, using accounts in Belarus and Kyrgyzstan. Manafort also lobbied for a Russian billionaire close to Putin to advance Putin's agenda by influencing politics, business, and news coverage inside the United States of America.
Would the gentleman yield?
No. This oligarch paid him $10 million a year for this work. It's right in front of us. Manafort also was the primary architect at the Republican National Convention last year, which Mr. Trump aides changed the party platform to the most pro-Russian since before the Cold War. As in any good investigation, Mr. Chairman, we must follow the money. The Financial Times reported that an investigation that it conducted uncovered evidence of ties between one Trump venture and an alleged international money laundering network. Using the title deeds, using bank records, and correspondence, the investigation found that the Kazka family, accused of laundering millions, bought apartments in a building partly owned by Mr. Trump, pursued business ventures with one of his partners. Mr. Chairman, I submit for the record the October 19th Financial Times article, Dirty Money, Trump and the Kazka Connection. Submitting it now. We know that following 6 bankruptcies, Mr. Trump had trouble getting loans and financing for his real estate business. German bank Deutsche stepped in when Wall Street stopped lending, giving at least $300 million in loans for Trump properties, and more personally to Trump's daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner. The Deutsche Bank has been fined for criminally transferring $10 billion out of Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. Time has expired. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting. I think there's only a couple of us on this committee that have ever filed a tax return and ever done a complicated tax return. I'm not sure who all, but I have for the last 30-plus years. And it's interesting, my friend from New Jersey, that you're rallying off about things that you would never find on a tax return. I've done everything from international tax returns to complicated tax returns to tax returns with 500 pages of information. And some of the things you're talking about would never be found on a tax return that you're talking about. That's the issue that's in front of us now, searching for information on a tax return. Let's face it, the release of presidential tax returns by candidates is tradition. It's not law. And if we abuse the authority given to the Tax Writing Committee under 6103 of the Tax Code to obtain the president's tax return in this manner, then I guess we can pick any political person we want to go after their tax returns. Further, it would set a dangerous precedent to other citizens' tax returns could be similarly released for political purposes in the future, coming from someone who has audited, reviewed, and prepared tax returns, 90% of what you talked about you will never find on a tax return. You'll find interest income, you'll find dividend income. Half the time you won't even find where that income's coming from. What I will tell you, you will find it, is on a disclosure report, which we all have to file, and President Trump had to file. So, look, we already have 2 congressional committees investigating President Trump's ties to Russia. We shouldn't be interfering with that. But in the end, I would hope that someone who has never prepared a tax return, somebody who really has never understood the complications of filing a tax return, would understand that you're not going to find the information. And this is a political mission, not a mission of fact, which is unbelievable that I'm hearing that, especially, again, I'm not too sure how many people on this panel, on any of these panels, have ever even filed a complicated tax return. There's a couple of us, but what you're looking for, I'm afraid you're not going to find, and I'm not sure why we would interfere with other investigations.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield back. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Levin, you recognize to strike the last word.
Well, let me respond to you, Mr. Renacci. If there ever were a president who needed to disclose his tax returns, it's President Donald Trump. I think you're wrong perhaps about 90%, but even if it were only 10%, let the public see it. Let the public see it. This is what was said not so recently. The CIA, the FBI, and the NSA jointly found, in quotes, Putin and the Russian government aspire to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible. This committee should use its authority to better understand the connections between the president and his family and Russia. The president now says he wants to lead the effort on tax reform. His past returns are directly relevant to our forthcoming discussions about tax reform. It's important to understand how such tax reform would benefit the president, his 564 financial positions in domestic and foreign companies, and his self-reported net worth of more than $10 billion. The Republicans selectively released private taxpayer information for 51 organizations in 2014. And this is what Mr. Yen, who's been cited by Mr. Pascrell, said about that. Although the disclosures, and I quote an article, occurred in connection with the committee's allegations of possible criminal misconduct by a high-ranking official, Lois Lerner, most of the return information released was completely unrelated to the oversight objective, and no disclosure was necessary to support the committee's claims. That's when you released those returns. In fact, there does not appear to have been any purpose whatsoever for the disclosures other than possibly providing a partisan political advantage to the committee majority. We're asking for the disclosure because it's relevant to the discussion about the Russian connection. And now you all and we all say we want to take up tax reform. The president said he wants to lead the effort with hidden tax reform, tax returns. That is totally incredible. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. My friend from Ohio, I want to continue with my opening statement, but let me say this. You are not only wrong, you're totally wrong. I hate to say that to a friend, but I'm telling you eyeball to eyeball. That's how I am. First of all, what he files, whoever files, you, me, Uncle Louie, doesn't matter. What he files depends on how he holds his business interests. He's a partner in many, many ventures. We're going to go into that, Mr. Chairman. He is a shareholder in S corporations, et cetera, et cetera. He has to fill out how many K forms under that schedule.
Would the gentleman
No,
yield?
I
Would the
am
gentleman
not
yield?
going to yield. Not today. Not today. This is too serious. He has to file perhaps in Schedule C, and et cetera, et cetera. The 2 pages that we received and the public received are a joke. You know it, and I know it. We're not a joke. I take everybody on this committee seriously. I know that you have the best of intentions. But for you to accuse me of doing this for political reasons, you are 110% wrong. We also know that Mr. Trump said the Trump Organization saw money, this is what he said, not me, pouring in from Russia, and that Russians make a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. We know that the Trump Organization repeatedly attempted to secure trademarks and develop real estate in Russia, not unlike what they did in China. We'll get to that. We have plenty of time.
Thank
This
you.
is
The
serious
gentleman's
business.
time has expired. Mr. Kelly, you recognize strike the last word.
I thank the chairman. My experience has been, and I've also done some work as far as paying taxes and having people prepare my taxes for me, but I always thought it was up to the IRS. If they wanted to do an investigation on me, they could do an investigation on me. I don't think I was ever a subject of a congressional request for it, but I'm going to yield my time to Mr. Renacci.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman yielding some more time. Again, my friend from New Jersey, have you ever done a K-1? Do you realize what's on a K?
I have no dealings like this,
Right.
Mr. Renacci.
And I have done K-1s. And if you look
Good.
on a K-1, just so you know, it doesn't reflect where the income came from. It doesn't reflect who the income came from. It lists a company or it lists an entity, and then it lists amounts. So when you talk about you want to see K-1s, it would be interesting for me to understand what you want to see on the K-1s, because I've seen plenty of them. And I can tell you there is no such information that you're asking for on a K-1. You also mentioned money pouring in from Russia. Unbelievable statement. Where do you see,
I didn't say
where
that.
do you
I quoted
see,
him.
it's my time, where do you see that on a tax return? Tell me anywhere that you see that on a tax return.
Chairman's asking me a question.
Oh,
Gentleman controls the time.
I
Mr.
have
Renacci.
not ever seen that on a tax return where you can justify money pouring in from anywhere. Seriously, some of your questions, I've done tax preparation for 30 years. I am still a tax professional. I figure I might leave here someday and need to do that again. But I have to tell you, what you're asking for, trademarks. You're talking about trademarks. I've done tremendous amount of tax returns. Tell me where a trademark is on a tax return. Tell me where you're going to get information on a trademark. You keep digging into things on trademarks, or on tax returns, which aren't there, which is why this is irrelevant, which is why this is political. It's irrelevant. You can't find it. You won't see it on a tax return. And that's why I don't understand. But I'm going to continue to listen to all these things you believe are on tax returns, and I'll keep asking the same questions. Tell me where they're at on a tax return. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell, you recognize strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, what businesses that Donald Trump owns does he have shares in? That's why there are many schedules, not just I just mentioned one, K1. 2 sheets do not tell us anything. Our constituents are demanding transparency. You're giving me complicity. A majority of Americans say they want an independent commission to investigate possible links between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And the petition to release Trump's tax returns is the #1 petition on whitehouse.gov. 1,085,000 signatures as of today. Now, the Watergate scandal investigators had a willing partner in the Internal Revenue Service who found tax violations in the returns of President Richard Nixon. With information from the IRS, a special prosecutor resulted in 18 corporate officials and 17 corporations pleading guilty to violations of campaign contribution laws. And the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee at the time was involved in reviewing President Nixon's tax returns. We have the authority. We have the cause. With all the conflicts we know about and all that we don't, we must gather all the possible information we can. The IRS is best equipped to conduct financial investigations into possible crimes dealing with money. The President's tax returns will provide us with the clues. I'm going to conclude with this in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman. Today, protests against the Russian government's opponents are being silenced by their government. This would give us pause here in the foremost democracy in the world. What are we doing here in the USA to protect our hard-earned freedoms and opportunities in contrast to the snuffing out of voices of dissent in Russia? Our answer should be open government, transparency, and honesty. As John Lewis would say, we need to get in the way. We need to get in the way of your will not to insist on the truth. I don't want any of my colleagues to be accused of complicity, but that's where you are going. In the book on tyranny, Yale history professor Timothy Snyder argued that democracy is fragile and has in the past evolved into fascism by the passive consent of those who go along to get along. To defend democracy, he argues, we must defend institutions. Institutions like the press, the courts, the Congress. I do not say this to be an alarmist, but because we are standing upon a precipice. I'm concerned about the integrity of this institution. During Watergate, Congress strongly protected the integrity of federal investigations. Many members instead slandered the IRS in an attempt to impeach its commissioner. They continue to keep Trump's tax returns hidden, even from the review of this committee, which is well within our rights to do. Party politics over country may have caused Mr. Trump campaign officials to collude with a foreign adversary in the name of hurting who they deem to be their common enemy, their opponent. Let's think about that. Do my friends and colleagues on this committee have the courage to put their country first? Or will we continue to hide the president's secrets, bury our heads in the sand, and prove derelict in our duty to protect our institutions? You know, Vanderbilt said, what do I have to worry about the law? I have the power. Our Constitution and our country is paramount here. I urge the committee to show a united front and unanimously support the resolution. Please report this favorably and bring it to the floor. Mr. Chairman, we have a mountain of evidence to offer into the record, and we'll get to it today.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Reed, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to the Constitution that my good friend from New Jersey recognized and speaks of, one of our near and dear freedoms in America is the right to privacy. And every citizen has that right. And with the balance of my time, I yield to my good friend from Ohio, Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. I'm going to go back to my friend from New Jersey and ask him where on a tax return is he ever going to see a list of every investment of every individual that, whether it's Mr. Trump or anybody else. I'm telling you, tax returns do not list investments. They don't. What does list investments are the reports, the disclosure reports, which Mr. Trump has done. Again, I can only tell you, I've practiced in the tax world for 30-plus years. I have looked at tax returns upside down every which way, and I have never seen a tax return that lists every investment anyone has. You continue to talk about things that are not on a tax return. The things that you are concerned about are on the disclosure report. The only time you would ever show an investment on a tax return is when you sell an investment, but you're not going to list investments that you don't have any transactions on. So again, I'm not sure where you're going with this, but there's no one more concerned about the integrity of this institution or this committee than many of us, including me on this panel. But I can tell you, when you talk about the institution, you better watch about dangerous precedents where you go after citizens' tax returns. And think about it. We could be doing, these are political purposes in the future. We can be picking anybody's tax return and just saying, we want to look at it. And if you're going to look at it, ask. I'd really love to hear. I'm going to keep listening because I am waiting to see everything you ask for. I wish you could show me on a tax return where it's going to be, because then maybe I'd agree with you. But what you're asking for is not on a tax return. That's why I know it's just a political push. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Meehan, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by, Mr. Pascrell, just asking you, I mean, you would submit, would you not, that there is no legal obligation for the President to release his tax returns?
Through the chair, my friend.
Gentleman yield. Mr. Meehan?
I'll yield
Thank you.
to Mr. Pascrell for a
My
second.
friend, there is nothing in the law that says he must, or any president must do this. That is absolutely correct.
Thank you.
That's why we're here.
The
Thank you.
gentleman reclaims his
I
time.
reclaim my time, but I will be asking another question, which is, you would also agree, would you not? And I enjoyed your history of the long history of this law as it's been interpreted really only a few times in our nation's utilization, and frankly by this committee. But there's no question that the intent of the law, notwithstanding the intent of the law, is to prohibit disclosure of private tax return information by the government, by us. It's to prevent it up to the point in time where it can be a felony if you don't do it. You would agree with that, would you not? And I yield back.
Could you ask the question one more time? I missed two words.
The intent of this law.
Oh, I know the intent of the law
And
the
would you not
code. And the code, sir. We know how the code came about, through the chair. We know how this code came about. It was written into the code in 1924 after that scandal I've talked about several times.
But it was.
That's why it was done.
Okay, the gentleman.
And
you,
while
Mr.
that code was
Pascrell.
being...
I claim my time
Mr.
back.
Meehan
Can I
controls
finish
the
my
time.
answer?
No, Mr. Meehan
Mr. Chairman, I
controls the
claim
time.
my time back. What I'm saying is we know all the way up through 1976 when it was rewritten, the intent of the law is to prohibit disclosure of private tax return information. It's to prohibit it. It's not to expand this or create powers. It was given to this committee so that we could make sure that this kind of information was not made public.
That's not true.
Gentleman
certainly
controls
is.
the time, Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, let me
Not
just...
at this time.
Oh, I thought it was you.
Mr.
Let me-
Meehan
I thought he
controls
asked
the
me a
time.
question.
Mr. Chairman, let me just reclaim my time for the conclusion of this. Let me just, this language. The committee enacted these taxpayer protections to prevent the use of taxpayer information for any other use than the administration of our tax laws. The provision under which you claim authority to release this information, Section 6163F, was enacted in response to the inappropriate use of taxpayer information by the Nixon administration. The very disclosure that you put to a vote today violates the very taxpayer protections this committee meant to create. Would you agree with that statement?
No, I would not, under any circumstances, agree with that interpretation, because
May I reclaim my time?
6103F came about in
I reclaim my
1924,
time.
long before Nixon
reclaim my
saw
time.
the White House.
Would you
Mr.
be
Meehan has the time. Mr. Meehan?
Would you be surprised that that was not my statement? That was the statement of your colleague, Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, during the period of time when he made that explicit argument during the Lerner circumstance.
Would you yield?
I will not yield. I'm reading.
That's how you're afraid of my
specifically.
answer.
Mr.
That's
Levin.
what the language is explicit and unambiguous. He may have his moment when he has his moment. I give my time back.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett, you recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this month, on an amendment that I offered, the committee voted for a second time along party lines to continue covering up President Trump's tax returns. And it's apparent from the comments that are being made today that this will be the third time. I think the committee has clearly struck out on this issue. Every president, with rare exception, for years, for decades, has provided this information. And while we have a fundamental disagreement about what these tax returns might show and why they should be shown to the American people, I think one thing we should be able to agree on unanimously: we have never in the history of this country had a president quite like President Trump. Mr. Chairman, I would say that the cover-up eventually will be uncovered, and it is just a question of how long this process goes on. I hope it will end sooner rather than later. There's some question whether any committee other than this one has the authority legally to obtain these tax returns. I believe there is a serious national security issue here. The House investigation has been totally discredited within the last week, but whether it was discredited or not, this committee has a role to play with reference to tax returns. And when you have the president's son-in-law talking with a former KGB official running a bank in Russia, and you have an indication from the president's son a few years back that the Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets, and that's a direct quote, there is reason to want to know whether there is anything in these tax returns showing payments to Russians or payments from Russians. It may be that not every bit of the information that we are seeking is contained within the form on individual taxes that President Trump may have filed, but there may well be an indication in those returns of information that will lead to that information, and that's why I believe the president went back on his promise to the American people and refused to disclose the very information he said he would disclose in the future when these audits were concluded. I want to know whether he has, as his son said, continued to have a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of their assets with the Russians. It is difficult to understand why the president, as a candidate and now as a president of the United States, has been so quiet about the outrageous conduct of the Putin administration. The contacts between President Trump and his associates and Putin's gang are rampant, and we find out more about them with each passing week. But in addition to the national security concerns, which are very real, I want to emphasize that the chairman and the members of this committee are misconstruing Section 6103, narrowly construing it really to justify this cover-up of the Trump tax returns, and that this committee has a significant interest in these returns as it relates to the administration of our business, both with reference to our trade agenda, from which we heard about earlier today, given the large number of trademarks that President Trump was able to magically get approved from the Chinese earlier this year, and with reference to our tax responsibilities. After all, this is a gentleman who has bragged during the course of his campaign about his ability to manipulate members of the Congress and to get pretty much whatever he wants in the tax code. I know our complex tax laws better than anyone, President Trump said, anyone who's ever run for president, and I'm the only one who can fix them. The question is whether he's going to fix them for himself or fix them for the American people. And without those tax returns to know what conflicts may exist for him, what kind of self-dealing may exist for him, we will never know. Section 6103 deals with more than tax administration. It deals with the assessment, collection, enforcement, publication, and statistical gathering functions under the laws and statutes. There is every reason why, in terms of its work in tax, And the fact that we are considering major tax legislation, that we would want to know that whether he will benefit personally, and that's why he is advancing these various legislative changes. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Noem, you recognize. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you know my home state of South Dakota is home to the Missouri River. It runs right through the state. It's absolutely beautiful. Most folks don't know this, but the Missouri River is the longest river in North America. It runs from the Rocky Mountains in Montana down to St. Louis, and it's full of fish. In fact, the state fish in South Dakota is the walleye. Mr. Paulson knows this too. State fish is also the walleye for Mr. Paulson as well. And you know, like many South Dakotans across the country, I love to fish. I enjoy it very, very much. But there's one thing that every angler on the river knows, and that is that the law is the law. It doesn't matter who you are. You get 4 walleyes that you can catch. They may be different lengths. They might determine where you catch them, but everybody gets 4 walleyes. That's the limit. And it's the same thing with our tax code. The law is the law. The tax code should be applied fairly, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a small business person, whether you're the president of the United States, period. It shouldn't treat people differently because of who they are or what they do for a living, and the tax code has been pretty clear on that. Mr. Pascrell has singled out this issue for political reasons and for political purposes. That's what this whole markup is doing today, and my colleague's resolution is a stunt that some even question the legality of. From my understanding, the Treasury Secretary may be breaking the law if he were going to comply with the language that's in Mr. Pascrell's resolution. I'm not sure if my friend had any legitimate lawful purpose for this resolution. Mr. Pascrell is suggesting that we single out a single taxpayer for political purposes, and that would set an incredibly dangerous precedent. The law should apply equally, just like the fishing limit. It doesn't matter who you are, the limit's 4 walleyes. And with that, colleagues, I urge you to reject his resolution. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Colley, you recognize. Strike the last word.
I think it's disturbing that my colleagues question the integrity of my friend from New Jersey and what his intentions are this afternoon. Questioning his intentions as an American citizen to request that the president do what he pledged to do in the election to the American people. At some point that he would divulge his tax returns when the audit is over. He made that pledge, I would remind the gentlelady from South Dakota. For fish or not, he made the pledge. He misled the American people. And he also said that once the election was over, he didn't have to give over his taxes anymore because he won. It's right, he's president today, and we're not. We get that. But he made a pledge. He promised the American people he would disclose his tax returns once the audit was over. And I would remind the gentlelady that his returns for 2016 are not under audit. And yet he still refused, after becoming president, to disclose those taxes. So to impugn the integrity of the gentleman from New Jersey, I think, is irresponsible. Irresponsible to do that. That's not our motivation. Our motivation is to find the truth. And this is an aspect of it. The issue here is not about the politics. I know that's uncomfortable, but it's not. It's about our country. It's not about embarrassing you either. But don't impugn the integrity of the gentleman from New Jersey or anyone else here who questions the president. It's about answering the basic question, who is President Trump fighting for? Himself or the American people? For example, earlier this winter, the president issued an executive order announcing that pipeline makers in the United States must use American steel in their projects. I support that action. I suspect you all do. But just a few days later, President Trump quietly reversed himself, issuing an order allowing the steel for Keystone Pipeline to be imported from foreign countries. This unilateral action deflates the initial boost to U.S. steel producers and hurts the jobs he had promised to create just a few days prior to that. Now, why this sudden change, an uncharacteristically quiet reversal on U.S. steel? We don't know fully, but we do know that Donald Trump owes hundreds of millions of dollars in debt to banks all over the world, including at least $300 million to German-based Deutsche Bank. We know that Deutsche Bank used to hold a 100% share in the German steel firm Kloeckner and Company, propping it up for years as it competed with American steel makers. We also know that Deutsche Bank is currently experiencing serious financial problems, and some of Germany's top industrial companies have discussed taking a share in the bank to help it financially. Essentially, German steelmakers would repay Deutsche Bank's past support by propping up the bank during its financial troubles. We even know that President Trump reversed his made in the USA order on steel. Deutsche Bank released a report which stated, quote, "The period up to 2025 offers the German steel industry good prospects for a stable and economically sound future," end quote. So did President Trump reverse his order on U.S.-made steel because one of his largest creditors may be rescued by German steelmakers? Did President Trump put his financial well-being ahead of everyone else? I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong, and quite frankly, I hope I'm wrong. And is it very easy for me to be proven wrong? Show us the returns. If President Trump is not being controlled by foreign bankers and other outside influences, he can prove me wrong by releasing all of his income tax returns and financial statements like every other president since Richard Nixon has done. But for now, without direct knowledge of the conflicts this president is under, we don't know why he is saying one thing like, "I will show my taxes once the audit is over," but yet do another once he's elected president. All we know is in the end result is an uneven playing field for the American worker. The question will continue to hang over him and my Republican colleagues who continue to protect him until we get definitive answers. There's another example I probably don't have time to go into, but I will ask a colleague to yield me time in the future if they have additional time. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back the 4 seconds that I have remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. And for the record, Mr. Pascrell is the author of the resolution. Ms. Noem questioned the legality of the resolution.
Mr. Speaker, she impugned his integrity. She impugned his intentions for bringing this legislation before the committee today. She did not. No, she impugned his intentions, Mr.
Regular order. Ms. Noem did not impugn his integrity. In fact,
I beg to differ.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know you certainly aren't impugning Mr. Trump's integrity either.
I'm asking questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Noem.
I'm asking questions, Mr. Chairman.
That's
right.
No. Question the legality.
I think the American people know exactly what's going on here.
Oh, yeah, they do.
They're watching. They're paying
Mr.
attention.
Crowley.
They know.
Absolutely
they know.
do. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Why are the President's tax returns important to this committee? It's very obvious, because this is a tax-writing committee for the United States House of Representatives. As a committee, we are preparing to undertake a comprehensive reform for the first time in 30 years. Transparency and full disclosure are essential to the integrity of this committee and to this institution. The President loves to boast about his huge and extensive business holdings. The President brags about gaming the tax code for his own personal gain. He says paying no taxes makes him smart. This despite his self-reported net worth of more than $10 billion. The American people have a right to know if the President would personally gain from proposals he will ask this committee to consider. The American people have a right to know if the President's tax returns offers clarity about business ties he may have to Russia, to Germany, to Saudi Arabia, or any other foreign interests that may benefit them and or him. Mr. Chairman, this Congress and this President have an almost exclusive obsession with taxes. Why aren't we asking for his tax returns? Last week should have been about health care reform and making it more affordable and accessible to the American people. It was not. It was a massive takeaway from the American people and a massive tax giveaway to health insurance executives and their cronies. The first thing this committee did, on the pretense of health care reform, on page 67, in 7 words, was give a massive tax cut to insurance executives. As I mentioned before, United Healthcare, one of the largest health insurance companies in America, paid their chief executive officer in 2014 $66 million. One salary, one man, 1 year. United Healthcare is under investigation today by the Department of Justice for defrauding the Medicare program of billions of dollars. The first thing this committee did on the pretense of health care reform was give him, United Health, and their cronies a massive tax cut. The tax returns of the president are perfectly and exclusively relevant to the work of this committee as it pursues comprehensive tax reform for the first time in 30 years. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. You're recognized to strike the last word.
I was hoping.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My friend from Pennsylvania made it a point to clarify whether or not this is the law that a presidential candidate or a president has to disclose his or her tax forms. And I think we all know the fact it's not. But it has been customary for the last 40 years. Every president, every presidential candidate has, with the exception of this one. If my friend would like to join me, I'd be happy to introduce legislation making it the law. I think it's pretty clear from the testimony that we've heard today that this is a pretty important issue, especially coming before this committee when so much is at stake given the tax return, the tax reform that we're endeavoring to take on. So I make that offer to my friend, and maybe we could avoid contentious hearings like this in the future. And Mr. Chairman, as far as your question as to how often we're going to do this and use this, from my perspective, I'll vote to see any president's tax forms who doesn't voluntarily submit those when running for the office. I think it's an important part of the election process, and it's something that clearly the American people want to know and want to see. When we talked about this in the last hearing, I talked about its impact on national security, and I'd like to go back to that. This president has numerous overseas investments, more than any other president in our history. Yet we know less about the finances of this president than any president in the history of our country. And remember what happened was General Flynn, the last time we were here, had just resigned as National Security Advisor. And there were reports that that General Flynn was potentially in a position to be blackmailed. This is important from a national security perspective. And since then, there seems to be a new report almost daily about someone associated with this president having some undisclosed connection to Russian interest. This, again, is a national security issue and something that we should all be concerned about. The Attorney General met twice with the Russian ambassador, but didn't disclose those meetings during his confirmation hearing. Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign chairman, had a $10 million a year contract with a Putin associate, Russian government associate. $10 million a year. I don't know of anybody who has a $10 million a year contract with anybody, let alone a foreign government that happens to be our adversary. And then Jared Kushner, we've already heard, the president's son-in-law, who
met with the Russian ambassador, with General Flynn. We just learned that he's had meetings with the head of a Russian state-owned bank, and not just any Russian state-owned bank, but one that is under U.S. sanctions because of their action in Crimea. I think this is an issue that we really need to take to heart from a national security perspective, and I think we should vote in the affirmative on this, and I yield the remaining of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, I want to get into what the definition is of what we can do under 6103, because what I've heard so far on the other side is absolutely incorrect. 6103 is not limited to examinations regarding tax administration. As you, Mr. Chairman, gave as the reason for voting no the last time, this is an incorrect interpretation. This was not just an administrative directive, 6103F. It was not. In fact, Section 6103I is specifically related to disclosure that is not related to tax administration. 6103I, disclosure to federal officers or employees for administration of federal laws not relating to tax administration. To intimate that tax administration is the sole purpose of the disclosure under 6103 is simply not true.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Smith, Missouri is recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm from the Show Me State, and this hearing clearly has showed me that this is just a bunch of political grandstanding. When you look at the law, President Trump has been obeying the law. He has to fill out personal financial disclosures. We, as members of Congress, have to fill out personal financial disclosures. I have right here President Trump's personal financial disclosure. It's over 100 pages. A lot of the questions that the individuals on the other side of the aisle are asking, they just need to read this. It's broken up in numerous parts. Part 1, filers' positions held outside of the United States. It's disclosed. Part 2, filers' employment assets and income. It's disclosed. Part 3, filers' employment agreements and arrangements. It's disclosed. I could go on with the 9 different parts. This is all about political grandstanding. There's cameras in this room. These people on this side are upset they lost an election, and they're trying to take points at the president. The voters in the 8th Congressional District of Missouri knew that President Trump never issued his tax returns, and they still supported him because they believed he was the right candidate for our country. What I can tell you is that according to the law, he has fulfilled the guidelines. Nowhere in the law does it say that he has to address their concerns that they're bringing up. What it does is they have to bring forward their personal financial disclosure statements, and he's done that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to have that form that my good friend mentioned submitted to the record, along with the 564 positions that the President says that he holds that are outlined in there.
Will the gentleman yield for a
So,
clarification question?
What's the gentlelady's inquiry?
I'm just curious as to what financial form it is. Is that a FEC filing form, or can you elaborate?
Well, the form that Mr. Smith has.
All time has expired. Mr. Kind,
Is there objection to that?
you're recognized.
Is there objection to that?
Yeah, there's objection in my view. I stepped out for a moment, and so if you'd resubmit it to me, I'd be glad to take a look at it. Mr. Kind, you're recognized. Strike the last
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to speak in favor of Mr. Pascrell's resolution before us today, and for 2 principal reasons. One, this committee is about to embark on a very ambitious and very difficult task of comprehensive tax reform. It's once-in-a-generation opportunity. And as long as the current president, one of the wealthiest people in the entire nation, refuses to play by the rules, we won't know what the implications will be on his vast empire out there, as we went with most millionaires or billionaires. But what makes him different is the fact he will be directly involved, I presume, in the negotiation of what that final bill is going to look like. Just for the sake of self-dealing, it would behoove him to release his tax returns. Now, he may not have a legal obligation to do it, but the second reason I think this resolution is important is because there's a higher principle at stake here for any democracy to survive. It's called transparency. It's called openness. It's called disclosure. It's called letting the sunshine in. It's called the truth. And when that belief in a democracy is eroded, the very pillars of our democracy are shaken, and cynicism rises. Illegitimacy of our government rises. The very credibility of our democratic institutions are called into question. If anyone doubts that, this past week we've had news coming out of Russia of tens of thousands of people taking to the streets in 92 separate communities to protest the corruption that the current president and the current Russian government is perpetrating on the Russian people. And unless we want to see that take over the streets of America, I think President Trump needs to start playing by the rules. And that's my final point before I yield to Mr. Pascrell, is we apparently have a person occupying the White House today who doesn't believe that the rules of democracy apply to him. A well-established precedent dating back to President Ford, where every candidate for President of the United States has voluntarily disclosed their tax returns. All of them, Republican, Democrat, and Independent alike, felt that it was a legitimate purpose for disclosing that to the American people, except for this guy today. And he's also gone further in attacking the very foundations of our democracy, whether it's free speech or the independence of the media, who he has called the enemy of the state, to the independence of the judiciary, to attacking the credibility of our intel communities, and even the credibility of this co-equal branch of government, the United States Congress. And that is being tested today in this committee. Are we going to act as an independent, co-equal branch or a bunch of lapdogs for this White House and this administration? That's why I think it would be smart for us to embrace this resolution, or this is something that's just going to dog him every day during his administration until those returns are finally disclosed. And it's going to seep into the tough work that we have before us and taking a run at this tax code that's ripe for reform over the last 30 years. And with that, I yield to my friend from New Jersey for the remainder of my time.
With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask my good friend, a person of character, Mr. Meehan, this question. May I?
Do you yield to Mr. Meehan after you ask the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Meehan, do you believe that President Trump should release his tax returns and all the supplementals that go with it, of course? Yes or no?
Mr. Brady, can I be responsible?
Yes, the gentleman yields to Mr. Meehan.
I wish he would.
Thank you.
I've called him to do it.
Thank you. I think you're being honest about it, and that's what I expected. Let me say this, Mr. Chairman.
May I stay with the time, Mr.
Chairman, I want to look at your interpretation, Mr.
Mr. Pascrell controls the time.
May I? Mr. Chairman, I want to look at your particular interpretation before we get into the scandalous material that we've uncovered. I want to look at your explanation of 6103, which was put into the code in 1924. I wrote you a letter requesting your leadership and requesting the tax returns of the president. I didn't get a return. I know you're busy. But our letter made some different points than the request I made to Senator Wyden and his colleagues made to Chairman Hatch.
All time has expired.
I'll
Ms.
come back
Jenkins,
when I'm...
You're recognized. Strike the last word. Ms. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Representative Meehan.
Gentlelady yields.
I thank the gentlelady, and I just want to take a moment to make one comment, because I know we've had a series of sort of characterizations that have gone on through this. And when I say this, I don't for a minute impugn the intentions of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. In fact, I think they know that I have great respect for every one of them. In particular, to the people that I'm talking about right now, but both Mr. Pascrell and Mr. Kind have used words today. Tyranny, Mr. Pascrell's word. Illegitimacy was Mr. Kind's word. And as a former special prosecutor, I think Mr. Kind appreciates this. But as a former prosecutor, there's one thing that has been lacking in this, which is, notwithstanding the discussions, we are talking about a voluntary, we've established that whether we would like it or not, this American citizen has a voluntary opportunity, but not an obligation. And because he's choosing not to volunteer to do it, notwithstanding that all of his predecessors have doing it, people don't like that. And so what we're doing here is let's kick the door in and let the cops get in the house and rip it apart and see if we can find a little evidence. And once we get that evidence, then we'll use it. And we'll see if we can get something on this guy. And maybe we can lock him up. As a career prosecutor, that's the kind of instinct which I know violates the sensibilities of everyone in this room. We don't do things like that in America. If we have probable cause, and when you looked at the Nixon situation, and when you looked at the things that happened at Teapot Dome, you had criminal activity by those individuals that was established, there was probable cause, and at that point in time, you've moved forward. For this process right now, to take the integrity of this committee and turn it into that kind of a witch hunt, that is the tyranny. That is what is wrong. And I just don't believe that this...
Would the gentleman yield on that point since you invoked my name?
Let me yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Renacci, and I'm sure somebody else. I'm not afraid to respond to that, but I'm running out of time. Give it to Mr. Renacci, please.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. Mr. Pascrell, a friend of mine, I would ask you, I will sit down with you. If you would withdraw this resolution, I will sit down with you. Well, you haven't even let me finish.
The gentleman controls the time.
If you would sit down and explain, we'll do this in a room where we can look at a tax return, where you can tell me exactly what you're looking for, exactly what you're trying to get at, and if you can show me, I'll co-sponsor the resolution with you as to what you think you're going to get. But I think at this point in time, you're not going to be able to do that. But I'm willing to sit down and work with my good friend from New Jersey to look at every item that he thinks he's going to find on a tax return. And when we come up and agree, because I believe what you're looking for, you're going to find on the disclosure statement. But if you withdraw the resolution and are willing to sit down and talk about a tax return and talk about the schedules and talk about what's on them, I'd be more than willing to listen as to where we can come with common ground to see what you're looking for. But when it comes to Russia and those things, remember, we already have a hearing, a number of hearings going on in regards to that. But I would yield time.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm going to yield for my colleague and friend to respond to my request.
I would like to, through the chair. Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields to you, Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you. My friend from Ohio, we're going to have follow-up on debts and losses and charitable contributions, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of supplemental information that goes with your tax returns. You need to look at all of it. And I have questioned...
I yield back. I reclaim my time. Look, I've done enough tax returns. You're not going to get the details you're looking for. That's why that's why I asked you. But I'll yield some time to Mr. Rice.
Mr. Chairman, the resolution is posted, lists 3 items they're searching for. Mr. Trump's debts held by foreign governments and foreign companies. You will find that on the disclosure, not on his tax return.
All time has expired. Excuse me, Mr. Rice. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my strong support for this critically important House resolution that we're considering today, and I'm proud to serve as an original co-sponsor. As we all know, the Emoluments Clause prohibits federal office holders from accepting foreign gifts of emoluments or emoluments without congressional consent. The creation of this clause was intended to forbid relationships that might lead to corruption. For 4 decades, Mr. Chairman, presidential nominees have without fail released their full tax returns. Yet we now have a president who promised, he made lots of promises on the election trail that he's broken, and this is yet another one. He promised to release his tax returns, and now that he's president, he refuses to. So my question today is, what does our president have to hide? Fortunately, Congress, and in particular this committee, has the authority to act and do something about it. The ability of our committee to review and disclose an individual tax information has been in law for 93 years. The authority was used in 1974 to review and make public President Nixon's tax returns. During our very first committee organizational meeting, my colleague, Representative Doggett, offered an amendment which would have allowed the committee to exercise this authority and provide the necessary answers and clarity that we now seek on the president's financial ties and obligations. I've also joined 165 of our colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, in signing a letter asking both this committee and the Senate Finance Committee to use their authority to request the president's tax returns. Additionally, I voted in favor of multiple House resolutions offered by my colleagues on the floor, which would have directed this House to do the same. However, each of these efforts were defeated and blocked by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. The reality is that this issue should not be bipartisan. Should not be partisan, Mr. Chairman. Instead, it should be truly bipartisan. We should all care that our president may or may not have conflicts of interest, and we should all care to know the truth. The public needs to know what potential conflicts there are involving the president's investments and business activities. The public needs to know what ties the president has to Russia and other foreign governments, and what influence those investments and past actions have on his future and his future as president. This is not only a historical precedent, but it also is a national security issue, as my colleague, Mr. Kine, has said. As a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I'm in a unique position to state that the recent revelations about possible Russian contact with the Trump campaign administration officers only heightens the stakes for reviewing the president's financial entanglements and potential conflicts of interest. Additionally, as we turn to tackling the enormous task this committee has before it of doing tax reforms, it is imperative for the public to know and understand how such tax reform will benefit the president, his 564 business holdings, and his self-reporting net worth of more than $10 billion. Now is the time to put aside partisan politics and hold this president to the same standards of transparency and accountability that we hold others over the last several decades. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, I want to address the claims. I think it's important. You state that the committees have never used this authority to target an individual in the manner suggested, quote unquote. You call such a review of the president's tax returns unprecedented, quote unquote. But I believe you know there is precedent in 1974, as I just mentioned. You further state that Section 6103 was designed to protect privacy, but failed to address the full legislative intent of 6103. It was put in the tax code specifically so our committee would have oversight of conflicts in the executive branch of government. The Congress recognized it needed this authority in 1924, and the arguments for protecting privacy and narrowly interpreting the purpose of 6103 ring hollow when you just voted to disclose the confidential tax information of 51 taxpayers in 2014. You did it. a disclosure that was in no way essential to presenting your case to the Department of Justice.
Mr. O'Benny, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This president is breaking 40 years of precedent with his complete lack of financial transparency, and his refusal to release his tax returns really is a red flag. If he has nothing to hide, then why not release them? He cited an ongoing audit with no evidence, that's his reason for keeping his returns under lock and key. Yet we know there's nothing but himself that's stopping him from releasing his returns. And given this president's evasiveness, his conflicts of interest, Congress has a constitutional responsibility to use its authority to obtain the records needed to perform rigorous, unbiased oversight. That's clearly in the public interest, and it's also something incredibly important to the public. We know that 3/4 of Americans have said that President Trump should release his tax returns, including 50% of his supporters. So we also know that President Trump is no longer a private citizen. He is an elected official in the highest office in the land, and he works for American taxpayers. And he has also boasted about his mastery of tax loopholes that makes him an exceptional guide for us as we go through tax reform. So the American public deserves to know if and how their president has been paying his taxes before entrusting him with shepherding far-reaching changes to the current tax system. And his tax returns in particular would tell us what he's paid in taxes. What tax breaks has he claimed? Does he have offshore accounts? These are things that are important that we need to see tax returns to tell, to obtain this information. Will this president benefit from tax reform proposals that are being pushed by the White House? The public definitely deserves an answer to that question. We've tried every which way to make sure that Congress has the facts needed to ensure transparency, and we're going to keep trying because people deserve to know what conflicts of interest, foreign or domestic, may influence the president's decision-making. So excuses or alternative facts should be unacceptable to all of us, Republicans or Democrats. I urge folks to support the measure, and I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, every time we've asked a question, whether it be in this committee or outside this committee in other circumstances, about the president's taxes or the supplementals that go with it and the disclosures that was referred to early before, we get the answer that it raises more questions. I think both sides could admit to that fact that more questions are being raised. And when we get into the specifics of all of these 550 or 60 investments, there are going to be more questions. And that's what I'm asking. Let's try to get an answer to some of these questions. Now, 6103, since many of you referred to, and I hope you read 6103, because the code allows for a disclosure of returns for a number of purposes. So if you haven't read it, listen, please. 1, a disclosure of returns and return information for use in criminal investigations. 2, disclosure to state and local law enforcement agencies in the case of matters pertaining to a missing or exploited child. 3, disclosure of return information to apprise appropriate officials of criminal or terrorist activities, etc., etc. Disclosure upon request of information relating. Certainly there are a variety of limitations on the type of disclosure and elements. That could be disclosed under each of these sections. But to pronounce that disclosure under 6103 is limited to disclosure for purposes of tax administration is absolutely false. Taking this a step further, to pronounce that disclosure to the committee under 6103F is limited to tax administration is untrue. By the letter of the law, 6103F provides a virtually blanket authority with respect to disclosure to the committees to either Ways and Means, Finance, as I said, Joint Committee on Taxation. The section outlines specific processes that need to be followed with respect to disclosure, including the requirement that any return be examined only while in executive session.
Time has expired. Mr. Schweikert, you are recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like Mr. Rice, who happens to be our tax attorney, to finish his thought. I yield to Mr. Rice.
Mr. Pascrell's resolution lists 3 items that he's looking for in Mr. Trump's tax returns. It says Mr. Trump's debts held by foreign governments and foreign companies. You'll find those in the disclosure. You will not find them in the tax returns. Mr. Trump's investment in foreign countries and foreign enterprises. You'll find those in the disclosure. You will not find it in the tax returns. And finally, the basis of this inquiry is apparently Mr. Trump's relationship with Russian interest and somehow a threat to our national defense. The third thing is Mr. Trump's use of any tax shelters, corporate structures, tax avoidance maneuvers, abatements, or other loopholes. Has nothing to do with with any Russian ties, has nothing to do with our national defense. They may or may not like what deductions that Mr. Trump takes, but he is not under 6103 required to disclose his tax returns. 6103 starts out by saying a taxpayer's tax return information shall be confidential unless, and it lists a series of exceptions. Mr. Pascrell, you went through some of those exceptions. If a child is missing, if there's a criminal action, none of those apply here. Very clearly do not apply here. You're saying that there's some kind of a threat to our national security if he doesn't disclose our tax returns. I submit to you that because we have a political disagreement with somebody, we can require them we can invade their privacy and require them to disclose their personal information. That is far more of a threat to our national security than whether Mr. Trump discloses his tax returns or not.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. I yield back to Mr. Schweikert.
Actually, it's not his time to yield. Look, I accept I'm one of the new members on the committee, and getting to know each of you and your individual talents. So I've been sitting here listening, and the fact of the matter is so much of what I'm hearing, and I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, but it's theater. In the discussion here, I've heard everything from German banks to steel to this, that. I mean, come on. The fact of the matter is, if you were being intellectually honest, you would go to the disclosures. And the disclosures, if you're having trouble finding them, I can provide you the internet. Mr. Chairman. I can find the internet link for everyone here. But my great concern is...
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pascrell.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman has the time.
Please let me
abide by the rules.
And look, let me finish.
Since he impugned our honesty, why not?
No, come on, let me finish.
Why not?
I've also learned in here that if you want to sound offended, scream into the microphone, which is great for intellectual discourse. But the fact of the matter is, what so many of you are asking is the weaponization of this committee. Because do we all end up here in the near future, and there's someone who we hear dodgy stories about, and do we get to sort of weaponize this process and look at them? Be careful what you ask for, because this could go down a very ugly path. And the fact of the matter is, so much what we're boviating, if that's the proper way to phrase it, saying here is already out there. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Schweikert yields back. Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
Well, if, as the other side claims, President Trump's tax returns would reveal so little, then the president has nothing to hide. And yet, we have a president who takes no issue with breaking 40 years of precedent by refusing to make his tax returns open to the public. This action not only shrouds his business holdings and activity in a cloak of mystery, but it also makes the American people and the world wonder what he's hiding. Just within the last 3 months, we've seen how the president's continuous use of the Trump properties is completely riddled with conflicts of interest. It's been reported that nearly 1 out of 3 days he's been president, Donald Trump has visited a Trump property. He's flown down to Mar-a-Lago 5 times on Air Force One, spending 17 days at the resort. In fact, in his 3rd weekend in office, he brought Prime Minister Abe of Japan to Mar-a-Lago and discussed a national security situation over dinner in public in front of many onlookers at dinner. Next, we learned that the Trump Organization has decided to double Mar-a-Lago's initiation fees, leading to accusations of profiteering on the premise that people would pay more to get an audience with the president. And now Trump has announced that he plans to host the president of China at Mar-a-Lago next month. It's clear that Trump has an incentive to host an event at Mar-a-Lago which gives him personal profit that runs counter to the nation's security. In fact, we don't even know if the members of Mar-a-Lago are screened for security clearance. What's to stop an agent of a foreign government from paying the $200,000 initiation fee to stay at the club and be near the president when he receives sensitive information? It's clear that the president is marrying business and government in a way that's not been seen in modern democracies, and that is unacceptable. As the committee prepares to take up tax reform, and the president has stated he would like to play a central role in that process, disclosure of these returns is critical to clarifying how much President Trump will personally benefit. I urge my colleagues to do what's right and pass this resolution, and I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
The gentleman who shot off his mouth doesn't know what he's
So,
doing.
Mr. Pascrell,
Oh, that's different.
you have asked for civility in order, and I will ask the same of you.
As the form on information return of U.S. persons with respect to certain foreign corporations, that's Form 5471. Or information return of a shareholder or a passive foreign investment company or qualified elected fund, that's Form 8621. Annual returns to the report transactions with foreign trusts and receipt of certain foreign gifts, that's Form 3520. Statement of specified foreign financial assets is on Form 3520. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And for him to talk about honesty and you didn't say anything, is that the way the rest of the hearing is going to go? Because I'm not going to be the civil person I've been up until now.
Thank you, Mr. Do you yield back to Ms. Chu? Great. Ms. Chu, you yield back. Thank you. Committee will stand in recess and will reconvene immediately following the floor votes.
The House Ways and Means Committee has recessed for votes on the House floor. A procedural vote is underway related to President Trump's tax returns, and later, the final vote of the day on a resolution to repeal an Obama administration rule to prevent Internet service providers from selling consumer information to a third party.
In the returns of President Richard Nixon. With information from the IRS, a special prosecutor resulted.
Just trying to start up.
committee will reconvene, and I recognize Mr. Larson. Strike the last word, Mr. Larson.
Yes, thank
when
you.
the chewing stops, you recognize for the last word, and we'll give you back those 15 seconds.
I thank the chairman, and again, as always, I thank him for the dignity that he brings to these hearings. And this is always a pleasure as a member of the committee to learn from your colleagues on the committee. I rise in strong support of Mr. Pascrell, the gentleman from Patterson, has been persistent in his goal and his desire to achieve what I think is just pure common sense, and that Americans have the right to know. And sometimes on this committee, you know, things can get heated, and one side is accusing the other of being on a witch hunt. The other side appears to be saying, no, there's a cover-up. It's that great justice, Leonard Hand, who said, democracy and freedom is that which leaves you not too sure. And in this case, there's more than enough evidence on both sides to leave people not too sure. So in that vacuum, it's obvious that what's needed here is the president to be forthcoming. I especially appreciated the words of Mr. Meehan. And had the president had the wisdom, he would have nominated him to be Attorney General here in this great country of ours.
Would the gentleman yield?
Not just yet. I take that as a compliment, Mr. Meehan. And but I'm also reminded of what my grandfather Nolan would say. In cases like this, when there's a back and forth between both sides, my grandfather would step and say, well, it's an old Peter Finley Dunn line. Trust everyone, but cut the cards. And the American people deserve to have the cards cut here. In fact, they may need a reshuffle and a new deal in order to get to the truth, the same plain and simple truth. And with that, I yield to Mr. Crowley.
I thank the gentleman, and just want to add for the record another example as to why we need to see these returns and why we, the committee, should see them and then determine whether we should make them public. We know that in 2012, Donald Trump and his company, the Trump Organization, signed multiple contracts with Azerbaijani developers for a planned 5-star hotel and residence called Trump International Hotel and Tower in Baku, Azerbaijan, a hotel that remains unopened to this day. We know the developers behind this project were close relatives and business associates of Zaya Mammadov, a former Azerbaijani transportation minister and one of the country's most corrupt oligarchs. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Law forbids American companies from participating in a scheme to reward a foreign government official in exchange for material benefit or preferential treatment. This law also makes it a crime for an American company to unknowingly benefit from a partner's corruption if it could have discovered illicit activity but avoided undertaking that due diligence. The gentleman in question, Mr. Mammadov, earned a salary of $12,000 a year, but was a billionaire. That's a big question. While the Trump Organization claims they have followed the law, did they really not realize that this guy had been accused of being incredibly corrupt? Come on. Maybe that's why they refused to release any detail of the investigation or payments made to or by the Trump Organization. As an aside, I should mention that this corrupt Azerbaijani family is also accused of having ties related to Iran. And we don't know to what extent Iranian companies were involved. Don't the American citizens deserve to at least know that answer? Especially since some Iranian entities have been involved in the killing of U.S. troops. Don't Americans deserve to know the full truth? So let's release the tax returns to the committee and prove me wrong. If there's nothing there, if Donald Trump did nothing illegal, if there's no conflicts there, then what do we have to be afraid of? But if there is something illegal or corrupt that can be discovered in those returns, why are you all protecting him? Let's get to the bottom of these questions now so the American people will win, not Donald Trump's business interests. And with that, I yield the 30 seconds to back to
Mr. Larson controls the time.
Mr. Larson.
Mr. Chairman, no one in any of the hearings that we've had have said that the law says that the president must give us the taxes. No one has said that we don't. This committee, as was just mentioned, would go into private session and then decide what we would do. So, Mr. Chairman, it's very clear what the rules of our committee are.
Yes, sir. All time has expired. Mr. Rice, you will recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was struck by Mr. Larson's quoting Justice Learned Hand, and particularly with respect to these three items that Mr. Pascrell seeks in his resolution to expose President Trump's tax returns. Items 1 and 2, as I said earlier, would not be disclosed by his tax returns. They are, however, on his financial disclosure, which anybody can see. And number 3, Mr. Trump's use of any tax shelters, corporate structures, tax avoidance maneuvers, abatements, or other loopholes to reduce or eliminate tax liability, as if there is something sinister there. And, you know, Learned Hand spoke very clearly on that. He said anyone, tax lawyers are very familiar with this Learned Hand quote and cite it often. Judge Hand said, anyone may so arrange his affairs that his taxes shall be as low as possible. He is not bound to choose that pattern which will best pay the Treasury. There is not any patriotic duty to increase one's taxes. Over and over again, courts have said there is nothing sinister in so arranging one's affairs to keep taxes low as possible. Everyone does so, rich and poor alike, and all do right. For nobody owes any public duty to pay more than the law demands. Taxes are enforced exactions, not voluntary contributions. To demand more in the name of morals is mere cant. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Yields back. Mr. Blumenauer, you recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been sort of an interesting exercise here. I appreciate the back and forth. For me, one of the issues that is most critical is that for the first time in American history, we have a president who has continued in office with his family conducting far-flung business activities with multiple entanglements. There is vast potential here to monetize the presidency, which when a person's brand and the way that these efforts have been manipulated by the president ought to give pause. I'm of the opinion that it's no longer just a good idea to examine the president's tax return. I think that it is imperative. There are all sorts of issues. Each week we're finding more connections with the Russians coming out seemingly every day. We're all aware of the $100 million payment from a Russian buyer of a home that Donald Trump just bought not too much earlier for $40 million. What was going on with that transaction? Can we find out what improvements were made dealing with offshore accounts? His stated opposition to the alternative minimum tax. We've only seen one tax return in the last 25 years, but out of that revealed that there was some $30 million in alternative tax payments. How much does he stand to gain with his advocacy for eliminating the alternative minimum tax? These are things that the American public, I think, is entitled to know. I think it's important for the committee to have to evaluate the interaction that we're going to have with this administration, with this president, who's, with his family, is conducting ongoing business activities around the world, involved with a wide variety of foreign interests in terms of lending and people who are involved with partnerships and utilizing his properties. We've never seen anything like this. I think there is good reason for all previous presidents since with the exception of Gerald Ford, since Richard Nixon, to deal with disclosure. But I think in this case it's imperative. We see a president whose public approval is plummeting. We see these entanglements. We see that we're spending upwards of $500 million, perhaps, for the care and feeding of his family as they go back and forth. Unprecedented scale of expenditure on the part of the American public raises questions, legitimate ones, that I think we ought to explore. And I, for one, would hope that we would step up and be able to do our job to help the American public understand what's at risk. And I see my friend, Mr. Doggett from Texas,
with a question,
flinching here, and I would be happy to
yield.
Is
the gentleman aware that on the partial...
Gentleman yield.
I do.
That on the partial 2005 return, which is only the glimpse we have out of all these years, that if Mr. Trump were successful and the alternative minimum tax was totally eliminated, he would have paid a mere 3.48% of his income. That would have been his rate, about the size of an employee's Social Security contribution, and that would have been it on $150 million in income. That's the kind of self-interest you're talking about, isn't that he could have in any tax revisions that this committee chooses to make?
Yes, reclaiming my time. I mentioned that he would stand to gain $30 million, but I appreciate you're putting it in perspective. But for the alternative minimum tax, he would be paying less than postal workers.
And would you further yield for a unanimous consent to put into the record, we've heard so much about this financial disclosure form, but all 564 positions on OGE Form 278E. I don't know what the chairman's objection is, but I would ask unanimous consent to put this entire financial disclosure into the record.
Mr. Doggett, is that a couple quick questions? Is that the president's financial disclosure?
It is.
Is it similar to the financial disclosure we as members of Congress file?
I don't know that it is because it's an executive branch personnel public financial disclosure report.
But it identifies 550-some?
It identifies 564 positions.
It is quite a deal of information without objection.
Quite a bit. Thank you very much, and I'll give you that.
Is there objection?
There's no objection?
No, without objection.
Thank you. Good.
Mr. Blumenauer?
You know, I'll give you back 13 seconds that you gave me.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman yields a negative amount back. So, Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Representative Pascrell for his tireless quest to bring this ridiculous issue, hopefully, to a conclusion. It's hard to add more to what has already been said on the subject, and I'm beginning to feel like it's, broken record on this side of the dais with our arguments in favor of what Mr. Pascrell is trying to do. But I guess we are going to continue to press forward in an attempt to get President Trump to make good on his promise. He promised to release his tax returns. Now, somebody who makes a promise and then doesn't keep it is either somebody who lies or somebody who has something to hide. The last time that the Ways and Means Committee addressed this topic, I reminded my colleagues that as members of Congress, we take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. And when we swear that oath, we recognize the responsibilities to our constituents and the nation as representatives elected to a co-equal branch of government. Holding the executive branch accountable is a minimum step in fulfilling that duty. Information regarding potential conflicts of interest, whether a person has been unduly influenced, or whether a person violated codes of conduct, statutes, or laws, is absolutely necessary oversight. Since President Trump has refused to follow the custom and practice in releasing his returns, I think it is our duty to support this measure to try to obtain that information. Since this committee last voted on this issue in February, we've continued to hear numerous news reports linking the president or his close associates to entanglements or worse with the Russian government on an almost daily basis. Until we have a full picture of the president's financial holdings, the sources of his income, and other pertinent information, we can't properly assess this situation. So I urge my colleagues on this committee to put our national security and the best interests of our country above party politics and support Mr. Pascrell's resolution. And before I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Crowley, I want to just address the issue that was raised by my Republican colleagues about financial disclosure forms. President Trump has not filed his financial disclosure forms for this year. Now, members of Congress are required to file those, and the deadline is May 15th of this year. And in fact, with extensions and other kind of dilatory tactics, it may well be 2 years into his first term before we ever see the president's financial disclosure forms. And that's why I've introduced a piece of legislation called the FAIR Act that would require all executive branch and government employees who are required to file a financial disclosure form to all file it by the same deadline that members of Congress and members of the Senate have to file by. And I think what's good for us is what's good for the rest of government. And with that, I will yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, tonight at 5:05, this was released, a story by Oren Durrell. You can't make this up. I have 40 hours of material to present to this committee, but it keeps on coming in. He wrote, Trump's privately held company works through a network of subsidiaries and partnerships that make direct connections hard to trace, particularly since he has refused to release his tax filings. In addition, some of the Trump organization's investors and buyers operate through shell companies and limited liability corporations that hide the identities of individual owners. Oh, by the way, the headline on this article, which will appear probably tomorrow, is Trump's business network reached alleged Russian mobsters. Let me read you about some of their names. Here. How about Felix Slater? He spent the year in prison for stabbing a man in the face with a broken margarita glass at the Rio Grande restaurant and bar in New York in 1991. According to a lawsuit filed by former partner Jody Chris, Sater held a controlling share of the Bayrock Group. I know that you know that since you are all studying this issue, which developed the Trump Soho condominium tower in New York, which was completed in 2010. How about Alexander Mashkevich? Mashkevich is a Kazakh mining billionaire, was a source of money for the Soho project in New York, a project according to a Bayrock invested pamphlet. Peter Klitashenko, a Ukrainian businessman who owned 2 condominiums with his daughter at Trump International Beach Resort. You find that in those reports that you hung up.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Paulson, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. And again, it's amazing that where this committee has gone. We've now come back to talking about mobsters and privately held companies, which will never show up on a tax return again. After 30 years of practicing, I've never seen a mobster's name. I've never seen a privately held. These things just don't show up on tax returns. So the request for tax returns, we moved from there now to saying, well, for us to do tax reform, we need to see his tax return because he's going to be one of the people who have to approve it. When you say that, you now have put everyone on this committee on record, because if we're going to do tax reform, then every member of this committee has to recuse themselves, and we'll never get tax reform done because every member of this committee might benefit from some item on tax reform. So we got to be very careful as to where we're pointing the fingers. We can't do anything under your scenario because now all of a sudden we're going to have, and you know, it's interesting. You shake your head, but Mr. Pascrell, that's exactly right.
Referring to
what's
an answer?
The gentleman controls the time, Mr.
Called my
Pascrell.
name, sir.
No, I said you're shaking your head because you realize that I might as well ask for your tax return so we could see what the benefit would be.
I already divulged mine.
Mr. Pascrell, Mr. Pascrell.
But that is where this committee now has gone. And again, that's what's amazing. We have moved now to talking about how we need to see people's tax returns to properly do tax reform. We should be able to do tax reform for the good of the American people without looking at your tax return or anyone's tax return and move forward on that. But again, I have to chuckle because if you can show me I've already given you the offer. If you can show me where mobsters are on tax returns and where privately held companies are listed on tax returns and all the things you've just talked about, I will sign on to your amendment. But let's sit down and talk about those issues and come up with a way where we can prove those things are on the tax return. But you need to pull this resolution today.
Good idea.
Mr. Pascrell,
You need to pull the resolution today so we have time to do it. Otherwise, you're right. All this is another journey down a path that will continue on. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson, do you yield back?
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Davis, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've listened rather intently all afternoon and into the evening relative to this debate. And it occurs to me that I've been told that the best way to create rumor is to withhold information. That in the absence of information, people will create their own. And so I can imagine what the citizens of this country are thinking and trying to figure out. We've heard all of the technical reasons that perhaps the resolution is not in order. We've heard all of the reasons that it is in order. I had some young people in my office, and one of them asked the question. That question was, are we supposed to believe what they tell us in school about our elected officials? That the integrity, the respect, and the dignity that we're taught about each and every day, that people comply with rules and regulations that it has taken years to formulate and to make a part of the public discourse. And then how do you get the highest elected officer of the land refusing to comply with some of those simple requirements? You know, this could get cleared up fairly easily. All the president would have to do is release the information. Then we would be in a position to talk about tax reform. We'd be in a position to talk about job creation. We'd be in a position to put another health bill on the floor. And so we'd be in a position to talk about all of those relevant things that make sense to the American public. Unfortunately, I think this discussion is going to go on and on and on until we get some resolution. I support Mr. Pascrell. He is simply asking what a citizen might ask. Show us the information so that we can know what it is that we're dealing with. And so I would yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell from New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. In an exchange between Representative Sarbanes with Richard Painter, who was the former ethics czar under George W. Bush, about schedules of interest, the question was, the average person, when they file a tax return, does not have all of these assets, foreign entanglements, and business interests, so they may not realize what kind of information they can get from an extended tax return. Can you just touch on one more time, the various schedules and what they provide in terms of information and how important that is for us to get some assurance with regards to our concerns about the president's conflicts of interest? That conflicts of interest are not in the tax returns, by the way. You got to find that stuff. We already have substantial reason to believe that he may owe his job to Vladimir Putin. This is what Richard Painter said, the ethics czar under George Bush. I'm quoting him. We ought to at least know whether he has financial dealings with the Russians, with the Chinese, with any other foreign governments, with oligarchs in those countries. The schedules I read into the record are very relevant here. Most of them focused on flow-through taxation. If you own an entity, a corporation, an LLC, and it does not separately file a tax return and pay taxes, the profits, the losses, the debt payments, all of those flow through your taxes, the taxpayer. So you would fill out these forms that you would disclose those payments, income and debt payments to those entities, such as the form on information return of U.S. persons with respect to certain foreign corporations. Do you know what form that is? 5471. Take a look at it. Or information return of a shareholder, or a passive foreign investment company, or qualified electing fund, Form 8621.
Thank you, Mr.
I shall
Pascrell.
return. Thank you.
Time has expired. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a lot of things have been said today. I understand the passion of debate. I understand the heat of the moment. But I want to be crystal clear for the record. This is not about drama. This is not about theater. This is a very real question, and it deserves a real answer. If the shoe were on the other foot, we would not be afraid to hold our president's feet to the fire. We would want the dark cloud. When we came in for voting, we saw a dark cloud, a very dark cloud, hanging over the Capitol, hanging over the city of Washington, D.C. There's a dark cloud hanging over this president, hanging over the White House, and hanging over this nation. We must see that the truth come out. The American people want to know where the president is getting his money. The American people have a right to know who he is beholden to. As member of this committee, as the check and the balance to the executive branch, as the representative of the American people, we have a right to ask these questions. We have a right to stand up, a right to speak up, to speak out. We have a responsibility to support Mr. Pascrell's resolution. It is a good resolution, and it is a necessary resolution. The American people are asking, why not? With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield time to Mr. Doggett.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank Mr. Pascrell for his good work on this. If you look at the financial disclosure on page 3, line 55, you will see DT Marks Baku LLC. And the point Mr. Pascrell has just been making is that if you own an LLC and you pass that income through on your tax return, you've got a series of forms that he was outlining, including foreign gifts that would be disclosed, that we would get through these tax returns. And if these tax returns don't do it themselves, then getting the information that those tax returns would lead to would get information that would relate, Mr. Pascrell, to the very issue that you just raised. And I would ask unanimous consent to include the article, Trump's business network reached alleged Russian mobsters, into the record.
Without objection.
And in that regard, it's also very notable what we already know about Mr. Trump and his charitable operations. Because fortunately, when Mitt Romney ran for office, he included his charitable foundation. When John McCain ran for office, he included his charitable foundation. But all that we know about President Trump and his charitable foundation is that he violated the self-dealing rules because of the one narrow form that we already have on it. We know that the Trump Foundation reportedly used the charity's money to buy a bigly 6-foot-tall painting of Mr. Trump for $20,000, $12,000 for a football helmet. So we have some information, but one would assume that along with these personal tax returns, we would get the charitable foundation returns, and we have a big stake in the work of this committee in that regard. And I would yield back so that you can yield to Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Chairman, my friend Mr. Renacci talked about this before, but let me put the icing on the cake. The average person does not have the ability usually to enact tax reform into law. He's the sole person in the executive branch of government who can do this. He should release his tax returns. Let me get back to this discussion that Mr. Sarbanes was having and hearing. Annual return to report transactions with foreign trusts and receipt, Form 3520. Take a look at the disclosure, see if you have that. Statement of specified foreign financial assets, 8938. Return of the U.S. purses with respect to certain foreign partnerships, 8865. A lot of forms. Those are only a few of the many return forms that would divulge this information. What will we be harmed by asking to put everything on the table and let the experts look at it, and then we determine whether it should go public? What's wrong with that? That's our job. That's our responsibility. We cannot undermine our own responsibilities. We have a duty to do what has to be done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All time has expired. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments? If there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee unfavorably report House Resolution 186 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on reporting House Resolution 186 unfavorably to the House. All those in favor of reporting the resolution unfavorably signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and House Resolution 186 is ordered unfavorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. Clerk, please call the roll.
We're a yes, right?
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunes?
Aye.
Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry?
Aye.
Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Aye. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Aye. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Aye. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Aye. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Aye. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Aye. Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Aye. Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Aye. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Aye. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal?
No.
Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
24 yeas, 16 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 24 and the noes are 16. The motion is agreed to. House Resolution 186 is ordered unfavorably reported. The House of Representatives without objection. I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the resolution, that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.